Chapter 3. The Nightly Ritual. Jacen closed the door of the rented tavern room and dropped his travel pack to the floor as he looked around. The room was small and cozy, with a large bed that was covered with stained but clean bedclothes. A wash basin and jug of water and a freestanding closet stood together in one corner of the small room. Stripping out of his travel clothes and briefly cleaning up at the wash basin, he began to run through a nightly routine of stretches. Honing his concentration, he began to direct his breathing while bending his body and executed a series of hip, back, and leg stretches. Soon he was warmed up and felt invigorated as the movements unlocked tense muscles from the travels and activities of the day. Bringing the stretching routine to a close, he unwrapped his travel mat and sat cross-legged upon it on the floor of the room. Placing his hands on each knee and holding his spine erect, he began to concentrate on the mental technique to slip into the superconscious trance state of the observer effect. As usual, when he would quiet himself, his mind would become overwhelmed with the whispering voices that seemed to surround him always. Some voices would speak to him more loudly when he would concentrate upon their sounds.
"Tavern keeper has treasure in the cellar. Kill him for it,"
came one whisper. Another hissed,
"There are sexuals here for you. Go to the next room."
There was an undercurrent of sound of many languages being whispered and uttered, most of which he could not understand. He mentally commanded the whispers to silence, and they immediately obeyed. While breathing deep and rhythmic, Jacen exercised his will, and the atmosphere of the room was cleared of all hostile energies. After 10 minutes of concentrated relaxation, he was finally able to slip into the trance state known as the observer effect. Time seemed to flow more slowly around him, and he took relaxed notice of certain impressions as they came upon him. He noticed a small cobweb in the corner of the ceiling while simultaneously felt an area of tension in his body he had not yet relaxed. He heard the vibrations of the wind outside the tavern wall and could more acutely hear the movements of the building as the other tavern members moved about in its other rooms. As he had experienced several times before when concentrating on the mental technique, he noticed a subtle falling sensation as if he were sinking into the floor beneath him. He felt completely at ease and free of all tension. After a time, he dropped the focus required for the trance state and began a simple meditation of renewal. As he relaxed and cleared his mind of all thought and impressions, he began to feel his internal energies resonate and flow with the energies of the nearby forest and air. He came out of the meditative state feeling completely refreshed. Jacen lay down upon the bed and deeply sighed, as he had not lay in a bed in some time. His lower back clicked in satisfaction as the final tension within his body was slowly released. He took out his master's journal and began to read while he dozed. He was never able to fully fall asleep, and this was his usual custom. As Jacen tried to rest his mind, he thought back to his earlier conversation with Janae and the many emotions that had come with their conversation, as he remembered other times in his youth when growing up with the Master. Jacen had learned to practice many fighting and breathing techniques until the movements had become like switches he could activate at will. He thought of how private a man his master was, a man unaccustomed to spending much time with other people, save the occasional trip to the marketplace. Jacen had often wondered if something had occurred in his master's past that made him prefer to live away from people. With the familiar stab of pain, he recalled the characteristics about himself that made it so difficult to make any friends growing up. Strange physical characteristics had begun to manifest within him when he was quite young. He never seemed to get tired or sick, and according to his master, he had greater stamina than average. He had always heard whispering voices and languages in his head, and sometimes the voices would tell him things about other people and places. At night, he could see things moving in the shadows and in other dark areas that no one else could see. With quiet distaste, Jacen thought of how whenever he tasted blood, he became much stronger for a brief time. As he had so many times before, he wondered at the overpowering lust that would come upon him throughout the month depending on the position and appearance of the moon. He remembered this strange lust had begun soon after his puberty years, and Jacen had quickly learned that if the lust was not released in union with another, he would be driven into a terrifying madness and lose control. There would be dark changes to his personality, and the change would often manifest as outbursts of enraged violence to those around him. Learning of this lustful quality, the master had tried to help Jacen overcome and control the strange periods of loss of control. They had practiced several mental disciplines that had aided Jacen in keeping focus. When these disciplines failed to work, the lust-empowered youth would typically seek out tavern girls, and for a small fee would release his lust into their willing embrace. It was this practice that kept him sane and in control of himself each month. With deep regret, Jacen remembered how he had accosted the transient woman and her 2 companions he had encountered during the night of a full moon in his 15th year. As the night had darkened and the full moon rose into the sky, his lust began building beyond his control. The mental techniques taught to him by his master were not working, as the diamond-shaped birthmark under his eye began to burn in uncontrollable pain. Unable to stand it any longer, Jacen had run away from the small farm where he and the master had lived. With a growing feeling of loss of control over his emotions, he had run as fast as he could in the direction of the nearest village where he planned to seek out a tavern girl. His body was somehow empowered by a separate force within him, and he had run into the surrounding forest, traveling many miles away from his home in a very short time. The voices were everywhere, and he could see distorted shapes and evil-looking faces looking back at him from the shadows as he ran through the trees. The murmur and hum of the strange languages was maddening, and many of the creatures began mocking and laughing at him as his lust grew beyond his control. The voices continued mocking him, and he had not even noticed the distance he traveled as he came upon the woman. He found her setting up camp for herself and 2 young men in a cove of trees slightly away from the main road. The lust-filled youth breathed like an enraged animal as he looked at her. From his vantage point in the trees, Jacen saw the woman kneeling and building a fire while her 2 younger companions were playing a game of dice nearby. His animalistic breathing began picking up, and his eyes became hooded in lust as he could see the outline of her body beneath the travel cloak she wore. He was hyper-aware of the bend of her hips and became enraged with lust at the sight of her thighs when her movements caused her dress to momentarily reveal her leg. Jacen inhaled the air and caught the womanly scent she unknowingly released. Just as the full moon rose to its eclipse in the night sky, a demonic force overcame him and he completely lost control over himself as his birthmark began burning in deep pain. Crying out in a great roar, he had run at the group, struck down the 2 young men, and had savagely taken the woman, spilling his seed deep within her within moments of ripping her clothes away. So savage was his taking of her that the woman had no time to push him away or even cry out. As his lust was sated, the woman had finally pushed her way out from under him and had run into the forest, leaving the spent and drained Jacen to brood about his actions with sudden regret. After he had remorsefully tended to the young men he had struck down, he set back through the great forest towards home, filled with revulsion over his actions. He arrived home in the early morning hours and began the morning chores, choosing not to tell his master what had happened. In the months to come, he vowed to seek out a prostitute rather than ever lose control over himself like he had with the unfortunate woman of the forest. As sleep continued to elude him in the tavern bed, Jacen's heart lurched as his memory returned to his one great love, Vel. From a very young age, Jacen had always heard voices whispering and speaking into his mind, voices that no other could hear. One voice, his favorite, would speak to him and would often say the funniest things that would make him laugh. One night in his youth, during the early part of the month, his favorite voice had prompted him to find a pool of water in the forest that was touched by moonlight. Intrigued, the young 15-year-old Jacen had waited for night and had run into the forest and found such a pool. He was filled with the zeal and enthusiasm that only a growing male in his years of puberty seemed to possess, but amplified by the characteristics of his nature. With moonlight reflected on the surface of the water, he looked curiously within the pool. Staring back at him in the reflection of the waters was an attractive and seductively clad female demon that appeared to be his same age. Jacen looked at the reflection of the young demon with wonder and delight as she laughed and turned her moon-reflected body around in a circle for his appreciation. It was the first time he had ever seen her, and something deep within him cried out in yearning for her. In his mind, she told him that it was she, Voluntarius, his demon friend from another plane who had spoken to him all these years. Jacen had reached out his hand to touch her, but his hand passed through her reflection as the water parted underneath his hand. She giggled at his effort to touch her and explained that it had been demon voices he had always heard in his mind due to his special nature, and that she and he would someday meet face to face. Jacen was thrilled at the discovery of his new friend, and that first night, they talked together within their minds long into the night. Jacen had not even become sleepy as he had come to know Vel. As the morning sun had risen and the moonlight had faded, Vel grinned at him and blew him a kiss as her image faded from the surface of the pool. Jacen had jumped to his feet with his heart lurching as he thought he would not see her again, when suddenly he heard her giggling in his mind.
"No, silly boy, you can see me again when the moonlight of the full moon touches the water," she said within his mind.
Jacen would return to the pool many times in the years to come and developed a great friendship with Vel, who seemed to know him perfectly and could always make him laugh. He always felt like he could be himself around her and never needed to hide anything. Although he would only be able to see her a few times each month in their secret moonlit pool, he would be able to call to her inside his mind anytime he wanted, and her voice became stronger and clearer the older he became. On the night of his 21st birthday, he had used demonic sorcery and had manifested her into his own realm. They spent the following 2 years together before becoming separated by events involving the quest for his master and a group of monks that lived in the Cathian Mountains. After those events had occurred, he had become separated from Vel and could no longer hear her within his mind. With deep sadness, he remembered the many lonely nights that had followed ever since, screaming her name within his mind over and over. As Jacen finally drifted off to sleep, small tears rolled down his face as he grieved over the loss of his mate. His heart cried out for the return of his one great love.